Good morning. Today is February 17th, 2022, and welcome to this installment of the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday, we bring you a new installment designed to benefit lawyers, negotiators, mediators, and arbitrators all around the world. We don't charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And our audiences have been so generous. Every week, one of my favorite parts of the webinar is when we announce the running total. So, Jean, would you please do the honors?
With pleasure, special pleasure today. You know, I keep saying we're getting close to that $250,000 mark. Well, we are really getting close now. We're about to the finish line on that part of it anyway, to cross it. $241,517. And so thank you all speakers, presenters, participants, everybody who's so generous. Thank you so much.
Wow, that is just awesome. And I know everybody online will pitch in to make Rabbi Brad Hirschfield the answer to that all-time great trivia question. Who is the speaker? Who was the speaker who put the Will Work for Food project over $250,000? It would make Rabbi Hirschfield's day if he were the answer to that question. So please, everybody, please, let's work on it. And now it's a great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Brad Hirschfield. And this is a webinar long in the making. About 15 years ago, I read Rabbi Hirschfield's book, and let's see if we can get it in focus here. Yes, it's called You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. And I thought that was just an incredible mantra or just an incredible saying for mediators and negotiators to keep in mind. And when we were thinking of who to invite to be our speakers here on the New Possibilities Hour, I saw Rabbi Hirschfield's book on the shelf and thought, well, let's extend an invitation. He was so gracious to respond. By way of biography, I'll read from the back of the book cover. Rabbi Brad Hirschfield is president of the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, Clal, and a popular commentator on religion and society. He's recognized by BeliefNet.com as one of our leading preachers and teachers. His blog, Windows and Doors, reaches more than 3 million people every month. He also has written the weekly On Faith column for the Washington Post and has been recognized by Newsweek as one of America's 50 most influential rabbis. We asked Rabbi Hirschfield to come and talk about how to negotiate with people you just don't like. Rabbi Hirschfield, please tell us a little bit about the food bank that's important to you, where you'd like people to direct contributions if they're able to do so. And then let's dig into your presentation. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for inviting me. And it's really a special privilege and honor to link our own intellectual and professional growth to being able to feed the hungry is simply perfect. We simultaneously feed the hungry and nurture our own intellectual appetites. And given the fact that I think every single one of us knows, given that there's enough food to go around, food is really a human right. And while I can talk about the Food Bank of New York, I want to be really honest. Maybe I'm going to violate the traditions of this space. I actually couldn't care less. There are hungry people everywhere. And the answer for me has nothing to do with me being the person who will push us over the $250,000 mark. If we get there, and I do hope we do, it's we who are doing that, not me who is doing that. And wherever there is a hungry person. So you can check out the Food Bank of New York, and yes, it'll send you to local communal resources, and I believe in them all, and people will find their own spot. But for me, the real privilege here is to be able to link anything we're doing out in the world with meeting the most acute of human needs, and that people should ever be hungry when there's plenty of food to go around. So I was inspired by your invitation. And I feel very grateful to be able to make any small contribution to the ongoing work that Will Work for Food and the New Possibilities Hour has been doing for quite a long time before me, and will keep doing long after whatever little contribution I can make will be.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you tell me, do you want to just dive in? Because I really do
Well,
want
why
this to
don't-
be a conversation.
Let's just dive in. Why don't you start with some opening remarks, and then I know I've got some questions, and perhaps others online will have some questions as well.
Great, that would be great. Look, 3 quick things. The first is the idea that we have to negotiate. We'll talk about the people you don't like part and why. I did throw that in, although you get the credit for framing it that way, and I thought you were absolutely right to do it. I actually believe, and I think we all at some level know, we as people, as Americans, as citizens of the world, are engaged in a great renegotiation with the human condition right now. And so this is about much more than an individual negotiation or mediation we may be called upon to perform or participate in. Everything from our own personal understandings of who we are in the world, to the social contract that holds together the fabric of the United States, to what we think the human condition is meant to achieve, is all being renegotiated at this very moment, in part because there are endlessly new unfolding possibilities, and also because, frankly, globally, we've all spent the last 2 years walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And at any one of those moments, when we brush up against death, we can either decide to let it terrify us and make us angry and stupid and mean, because most people don't want to die, we want to live, and so we shut down, or it can reorient us toward the lives we most want to live. And so in this moment of renegotiation, I think that's what we really are trying to all figure out in our own ways to do. A big piece of that, especially when it comes to negotiation, it seems to me, mediation and arbitration, is we are often in different disciplines trained to think that the fundamental question is, how do I deal with them? Whoever the them across the table is, on the other side of the screen is. And what I want to invite us to do for today is understand that as important as whose they are, whatever that might mean, it's at least as important, and it may be even more important, not just to think about how do I deal with them, but how do I understand myself? What am I doing at that table? Who am I at that table? What are the premises and biases that I bring with me to that table? And the more clear I can be about that, the more effective I can be at dealing with whatever them I confront, including the ones I don't like, or the ones who are very different or very strange to me. And I'll tell you one story, and it does come out of the book, and then we can open it up. And it's actually the story of how the book got its title. I had landed in Syracuse, New York, home is New York City, to do a speaking gig, a leadership training program. And I hop in the cab, and as soon as I hop in the cab, because it's Syracuse, it's not New York City, there's no cab line, so you just jump right in and off you go. And as the cab is pulling away, I suddenly look around and I'm like, this is a very different kind of cab than I've ever been. Because without exaggeration, I can tell you that every surface of this cab was covered with a sticker or a poster or a sticky note that said something like, Jesus loves you, and faith will save you, and God is the way, and had little biblical verses. And they were everywhere. And it wasn't just all the Jesus loves you paraphernalia. There was actually a giant, well, as giant as can be in a car, it looked giant to me, cross that was mounted on the dashboard of the car, like the old song, Plastic Jesus. This wasn't a plastic Jesus, this was a plastic cross. And there were even little pocket Bibles suspended from where the frame of the car meets the windshield. And I suddenly realized I'm not in a cab at all. I'm in a rolling cathedral. And now that I'm in this rolling cathedral, and I will be honest, there was a moment I thought, should I get out? But of course, the car was already moving. There was no getting out. So I figure, okay, well, when I go to church, I want to know who's the pastor. So I start trying to check out who the driver of my rolling cathedral is. And as I'm trying to check him out, and he looked to be somewhere in his mid-60s, he had long, greasy hair. He had a beard that wasn't quite a beard, but he clearly hadn't seen a razor in a few days. And he was wearing a tattered shirt that was cut off at the sleeves. But more importantly than me checking him out, I realized that he was trying to check me out. And that took some real contortions because he's trying to drive the cab and use his rear view mirror And what he was really checking out wasn't just me. He was trying to check out if what he thought he saw on the back of my head was actually there or not. And as he's doing these contortions to try and get just the right angle to see, is he really wearing a skull cap? I hear from the front, in one of those voices that you can definitely only acquire from years of smoking many packs of cigarettes a day and washing it all down with a fair amount of Jack Daniels. So, what do you do? And the truth is, every fiber of my being said lie. Do not tell this man you're a rabbi. I started to go through all the careers my parents had probably originally wished I had taken up. And I was going to tell him that. And I said, no, I'll just tell him the truth. I'm a rabbi. A rabbi? I got so many things that I want to ask the rabbi. And I'm like looking around the cab going, I bet you do. And he says, can I ask him? And I'm thinking, we're going 70 miles an hour down the interstate. Where am I going? Ask away. Rabbi, what do you think of Jesus? And I'm like, oh, an easy question. And I said, look, if you're asking me, do I believe that Jesus Christ is God's only begotten Son, through whom and only through whom I can find salvation, as I'm guessing you do based on the decorations in here, then I'm going to really disappoint you, because that's not how I think about things. But if you're asking me, do I think that Jesus is one of humankind's most important teachers, from whom all people have something to learn about how to lead a good life? I believe in that. And there's complete silence from the front seat. And I'm like, okay, well, that went over like a lead balloon. And then all of a sudden I hear him from the front go, huh? And I'm just going to lay back and wait and see where this goes. And he says, now, Rabbi, if you don't believe the first thing, why do you believe the second thing? And if you do believe the second thing, why don't you believe the first? And having never said it quite this way before, I said, I guess because I don't believe you have to be wrong for me to be right. Whoa! He starts driving the cab off the highway. I mean, he's completely freaked out in the front seat. We've spun across 3 lanes of traffic. The gravel is now kicking up. And I'm like, this is great. I'm going to die in the back of this man's rolling church cab, because I was honest with him. And I'm like, please drive the car. And he's like hyperventilating in the front seat going, you don't have to, you don't, what, huh? I'm like, please drive the car and I will answer any question you have any way you want. Just pick a lane and stay in it. He eventually calms down and he picks a spot and he's driving and he's still kind of very emotional. I said, Rabbi, what, you don't have to, what was that? And the truth is, I didn't entirely know what I had said, partly because I had to put my heart back in my chest from the near-death experience of running across the interstate, but also I had never said it that way before. This is a real-time formulation, and this is part of the methodology, of course. It's a real-time formulation in the context of the person who I'm sitting with. It wasn't some like, oh yeah, I know this little sentence, I'll give him that one. Right? We have to be alive in the moment to be effective in the lives of others. And so I said it again, having realized I think I do know what I said. You don't have to be wrong for me to be right. He goes, Rabbi, I never heard anything like that before. In fact, I got so many other questions. I mean, you can ask me anything you want if you don't kill us. And he said, now, Rabbi, to ask you the next question, this is a question about my wife. And I'm like, can I have another Jesus question, please? That would be so much easier. And he said, but to ask you the question about my wife, I got to tell you a little about my life. I'm like, okay. He said, you might not guess it, Rabbi, but for a lot of my life, I was addicted to drugs and alcohol. I did not respond that, oh yeah, looking at you, I can believe it. It's not a big stretch. And he said, now for the last 3 years, I've been absolutely clean and sober. I said, well, first of all, don't tell me anything more. First, let me tell you that I hope you tell this part of your story to everyone who gets in the back of your cab. He goes, why? I said, because everyone who gets in your cab, including me, is wrestling with something. I hope they're not wrestling with anything as monumental as you have had to. That everyone is wrestling with something, and you are living proof that we all have the ability to wrestle through to the other side, to a healthier place. So now he's sitting up, he's feeling pretty good about himself. And I wasn't joking, again, appreciating that while there are always going to be differences between us and the people sitting on the other side of the table, there's usually a lot more we have in common than we've been led to believe. And he says, well, that's the thing, Rabbi. I got saved 3 years ago, and that had a lot to do with my sobriety. And my wife, she hadn't been saved. And I said, well, tell me about your relationship with your wife. He said, that's why it's hard. We got together when I was about 20 years old. And that means we've been together 23 years. By the way, that's when I knew he wasn't exaggerating, because he looked like he was 63 and he was 43. And only a life of addiction can do that to you. And I said, and she's been with you for the whole 23 years, and only the last 3 of which you've been sober? He goes, yeah. I said, she sounds like an amazing woman, because I'm guessing you weren't much of a husband during those first 20 years. No, I wasn't. But my pastor says that we got to get her saved. And if we can't get her saved, maybe I should get a new wife. I took a deep breath. And I said, the truth is, I think actually you're a really blessed man. He goes, why is that? I said, because you've been saved twice. First, you were saved by your wife, and then you were saved by your faith. And I can't imagine why you'd ever give up on either one of them. Whoa! And he starts driving again. I'm like, oh my God, we're going to die again. And I realized, no, we're not going to die. We'd actually gotten to the retreat center. He was dropping me off, but he came screaming into this parking lot. And as soon as we stopped, and we stopped hard, he jumps out of the car and he comes around to my side. And I'm like, oh man, you really messed up now. He's angry because he flings open the door and he's really reaching into the cab to pull me out. And I realized as soon as I looked at his face, he wasn't pulling me out because he was angry. He literally pulled me out of the cab and fell into my arms. Head on my shoulder. My neck starts to get wet. He's weeping. So here we are, 2 strangers, middle-aged men, in the parking lot of a retreat center, holding each other in our arms, and he's crying on my shoulder. Now, there's nothing to do except let it play out. It felt like about an hour and a half. It was probably 3 minutes. And he picked up his body and kind of got himself together and sniffled and looked me in the eye, and he pushed his hair way back and tucked it behind his ears. And he goes, Rabbi? I go, yeah. He goes, you'd make a good pastor. And I thanked him, and I gave him a last hug, and the biggest tip I've ever given any cab driver in my life. And he went on his way. Now, the fact is that that was a negotiation of sorts. He had to navigate and renegotiate new territory in his life. And so did I. And what allowed it to work was that it couldn't have been rehearsed. I had to be willing to discover things not only about him, but about myself in the exchange. I had to be genuinely curious about someone whose life in so many ways couldn't be more different from my own. And I had to figure out how to cultivate that curiosity without feeling I was giving up my integrity. And it seems to me that that willingness to be surprised in our work, to be genuinely curious about those who are even entirely different from us, and to not experience that as eroding our integrity. Because I am not suggesting the key to a good negotiation is go in, say yes to everything and make them happy. That's not a negotiation. That's called rolling over. I'm simply suggesting that with the right kind of curiosity about others and our own willingness to surprise ourselves, we can actually maintain our integrity and be more effective at encountering plenty of people, many of whom are quite different to us, and some of whom we may not even like. So with that, I'm gonna stop there and tell me what you want to talk about.
Well, that's a fantastic, fantastic episode of your life, Rabbi Hirschfield, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. There's so much to learn just from that. Let's try to take it into the kinds of negotiations with which we might deal as lawyers or mediators. So the first challenge that we face many times is people who just don't want to listen to each other. They simply want to be vindicated. We can't produce that kind of a result generally in a business or legal negotiation. You have to give something to get something. And at the same time, there are people who show up at our mediations very dug in. Sometimes the lawyers have let us know in advance that their clients are very dug in. And sometimes the lawyers themselves are very dug in. When we are parachuted into one of those kinds of situations where people simply don't want to listen to each other, what can we do? What are some pointers you can give us?
So they're great questions, Jeff, and please call me Brad. Or I'm going to have to start using titles with you too, which you've earned, so I'm happy to. Well, let's start with the fact that every one of us, including me, including you, has had times we didn't want to listen. So it shouldn't totally surprise us when someone else who's in the midst of a high stakes negotiation doesn't want to listen, because we all get to a place where we can't take it anymore and we don't want to listen. That's the identifying with some of the deep connections we have, even to people who are, forgive me, a pain in the ass. They may really be a pain, but they're not entirely different from us because we all get to a place we don't want to listen. That's number one. Number two is I know that if we want to be listened to, we have to start by listening to them. The simple rule is, before any of us can be someone's teacher, we have to be their student. Before we can lead that negotiation to the place where we know it needs to get to, we are going to have to be students of the other people sitting at that table. It's sometimes really upsetting to do that. It can literally be physically nauseating. And that's okay to admit, but I want to be clear, unless it's a physically coercive situation, there's no shortcut. If it's a physically coercive situation, so then, bang them in the head with a 2x4, but that's not the situation we're in. They're obnoxious, they're difficult, they're stupid, whatever we think of them, that's fine, maybe they are. No one is going to be very successful without coercion, and I don't think any of us believe in that, if at all possible, in being anyone else's leader or teacher without first being led by them and being their student. And the third part of it has to do with the fact that I have never met a human being who has said they have been heard too much. And so the willingness to listen already resets the table in ways that always makes a positive difference. Does it get us fully where we want to go? I don't know. But I know that's how at least we begin to enter the process. The willingness to be their student before we become their teacher, to follow their lead before we lead the negotiation, and to appreciate people like to be heard. So listen first. There'll always be room to talk afterwards. And then the last piece is where I started, to be able to identify with the fact that there are times when all of us get to a place we really don't want to listen anymore. So we can identify with that feeling. The other thing you asked about was this issue of people wanting to be vindicated. And I would say, in all candor, don't we all usually want to be vindicated? But I would suggest there's a difference between being vindicated and having total victory. And if we can find the space where we can offer people vindication, validation, at least of some piece of who they are and what they are, we can often get to exactly what you talked about, Jeff, the fundamental insight that it's got to be about both giving and taking. I'm not suggesting we're not there to take. We are. I am suggesting that the precursor to the taking has got to be the giving. And that's the last piece to a long answer to your good question. It pays to walk in not only knowing what we think we're willing to give, but to imagine that we're going to give things we can't yet currently imagine. And that's not a loss. That's the real-time give and take that we can't anticipate until we're sitting across that table from another real person with real needs and expectations.
So communicating that to someone, that you may be asked in this negotiation to give up things that you can't even imagine now. It doesn't sound like a very inviting way to get someone to the table. How do you do it? What do you say?
You start, no, I want to be clear. You start by saying it yourself and to your client. Mm-hmm. We may be walking into a room and asked to give up things that we cannot currently imagine. And I think the way we can get ourselves into that mindset is by saying, but guess what? We're going to do the exact same thing to them. We are going to ask them to give up things they cannot currently imagine. And that's okay, because we are advocates for a particular side. This is not some kumbaya moment. We are going in there to accomplish something. But the ground of us being able to accomplish surprising victories is our willingness to be just as bold in our imagination about what we can give up as we're asking them to be about what they can give up.
So that give up, that last give up often happens in a mediated negotiation at the end. It's 5 o'clock at night, it's 10 o'clock at night, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. And we've been at loggerheads, and people need to make one last jump to get it done. And that last jump is not, or that last sacrifice, if you will, you're not cutting into fat anymore. You're not even cutting into muscle. You're cutting into bone. And that is tough for people to do. And as mediators and lawyers representing clients in negotiations, we believe that it would be in people's interests to make that last cut in order to get the benefits of finality. And often it's very difficult to get that through to the person who we're asking. Sometimes, Brad, we say if logic was going to work, it would have worked long ago.
Correct.
In getting the deal done. So when you're at the tail end of a negotiation, what are some of the approaches or techniques we can use to help people make that last sacrifice or that last move in the negotiation to get it done?
So the frame for the answer, by the way, practically speaking, of course, it always happens at the end. That's why it is the end. Like we think, oh, these breakthroughs always happen at the end. No, no, no. They become the end because we had the breakthrough. And to some extent, exhaustion can be our ally. And we all know that. We get to certain places where the thing we thought we would fight for, we're so tired, we're like, it's okay, let it go. And then we'd have to say, oh, right, all those painful hours were actually not a problem. They're the process. So that's just on the issue of why it happens at the end. But I want to be clear, I'm not a big believer in altruism. I don't think people very often want to or should have to give up who they are. And I'm not a big fan of self-transcendence. I'd be a terrible Buddhist. Because as far as I can tell, when you transcend yourself, you're going to be whatever next self you're going to be. So there is no self-transcendence. What there can be is enlightened self-interest. And I think what can happen is people can be asked, we can keep fighting. What's the cost of continuing the fight to you? Not to them, because if it was just to them, beat the hell out of them. What is the cost to who you want to be of staying in this fight? By the way, including telling that client, you are right. They are wrong. It's not about right and wrong. You're right. They're wrong. This is not about correctness. This is about efficacy. And let's talk about the cost of continuing the fight, not the justice of continuing the fight. I'm sure our side is just and they're evil. Yeah, I don't always believe that, but let's frame it that way. But by the way, reassuring people of the justice of their cause often gives them more flexibility, because what they can experience is, I'm sacrificing on a point of order or a matter of dollars. What I'm not sacrificing is who I am in the world. And I think people need to be, ironically, affirming their correctness is often the path to getting greater flexibility. Because effectively what we're doing is separating their commitment to a sense of integrity, which no one should have to give up, to the ability to say, what do you really want to achieve here and at what price? And at the end of the day, if the price, however brutal it is actually worth it, there's nothing we can do. They will keep fighting. So it's about relocating the conversation from who's right and who's wrong to what is the cost of being right, and how can you maintain your integrity and actually get something done and close the deal. And that has nothing to do with the person on the other side of the table. That's, in many times, you leave the room and you talk to that client and the client talks to you, because actually that's what I says, no, they're idiots. But who do we want to be?
So sometimes, Brad, we'll ask questions like that, and we will get back in one degree, one way or another, some talk about revenge. Revenge is a big motivation in litigation contexts. They done me, they treated me terribly, whatever it was happened, and it sometimes hurts people to the very essence of their identity. You see this even in what might be such unexpected situations as intellectual property cases. I can't tell you how many times in a copyright or patent case, the inventor or the composer, the author, will give that kind of cradling the baby gesture and say, they stole, it's my baby. It's as if they stole my baby. And so we get this emotional intensity, we get this desire for revenge, and we'll get a response from someone. I don't care what it costs me, they must suffer.
Again, I would be lying if I didn't say, I understand that emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And I identify with the person whose intellectual property is actually being kidnapped. It is their baby. They did give birth to that. And so I wouldn't say, well, you know, it's an idea, you'll have other ideas. Can you imagine saying to a person as their child was taken from them, don't worry, you can have another? See, I think with the best of intent, we try and contextualize that pain and that loss out of existence. I'm suggesting, no, go right at it. That idea is your baby, and you birthed it with your blood and your sweat and your tears. What we're talking about here is not justice. What we're talking about is here, what are you willing to do so your baby can live? Even if it's in an unjust circumstance. In other words, I think that we really need to be able to appreciate, you know, that feeling. And then, by the way, to talk about the cost. Like, Matt, do you know what this will cost you? Really spend time. Let's talk about the cost. And then let's ask, who is paying that cost? Because oftentimes people advocate high cost deals because they're not the one paying the price, right? So it's very important because, by the way, if someone's advocating a high price deal and they don't pay the price, that's a whole different thing. Most people, when they realize that, because we want to think of ourselves as ethical people, you know, we'll come to grips with that in some way. But I want to be clear that I think a lot of us live in settings where we're told revenge is inherently bad. And while I think that's mostly true, the idea that on a whole bunch of issues, we need to feel that that which has been put wrong will be made right, that the scales will be rebalanced, is a very legitimate feeling. The idea of distributive or redistributive, more accurately, justice is a legitimate concept. My concern is that people who advocate for it never talk about what does it cost to do the redistribution, right? What does it cost financially, emotionally, psychologically, communally? And let's really look at the balance sheet. That is to not try and lecture someone out of their ferocity, of their attachment, but really spend time asking, what's the price of it? Because at the end of the day, if the price is really supremely high, but they're willing to bear it, there is very little you can do. There isn't a lot you can do. And by the way, the flip side for us, right? Because if the client in that, you know, story can be guilty of worshiping the principle of the absolute justice of their cause, we have to be honest about the temptation to worship the principle of let's just get the deal done. And we often mean it well, but you know what? Sometimes the answer is no. It's not going to get done. I mean, this is the problem with diplomats. Diplomats are so attached to the identity of being the people who close the deal, they often make really bad deals. And it's not they're doing it consciously, like, but I'm here to close the deal. And if I can't close the deal, then I must have failed. I don't think that's true. Sometimes there is no happy ending or even partially happy ending. You walk away and it's true. You failed to close the deal, but you're not a failure. So again, the question has to do with a lot of not just who's the they, whether the they is the parties across the table or the they is our client, it's who are we, right? Where is our attachment to closing the deal so high that we may actually make deals that even we don't end up believing in when we have a little bit of distance, and we do it with the best of intentions because after all, we're the negotiators. And so we have to close the negotiation. We must have failed if we didn't. No, we would accept sometimes, even with the best of intentions and monumental effort, there wasn't a deal to get done that way.
So to get to that point, there needs to be, as you said, a balance sheet of the costs and benefits of proceeding. Some of the costs are very easy to measure. A lawyer can tell a client it'll cost approximately this many dollars to get to trial and this many dollars to conduct a trial. And others are very hard to quantify. The emotional wear and tear of being in a lawsuit, the distraction from other activities, the anxiety, the fear that things could go horribly awry, all of that stomach churning stuff. How do you help people balance or measure these intangible things?
Well, first, you have to be able to talk about them with the same clarity that we do about the financial and time costs. And more importantly, since many of the things you mentioned can't be measured until you're experiencing them, it's not a one-off deal. You have to keep checking in. What did we think we were going to pay? What are we currently paying? Is it still worth it? If it's still worth it, why is it still worth it? See, the why becomes increasingly important. And the why is important because no one wants to be told by their advocate, well, actually, we were wrong about this. I mean, no one wants, they don't want to hear that. We don't want to hear it. Who are we kidding? But I think people are able to hear, again, we may be right, but the cost of this is getting not just arithmetically, but geometrically higher in all kinds of ways. How are you sleeping? How are you treating the person you sleep with at night? How do you feel about the rest of your life? How good would it feel to walk away from the SOB on the other side of the table? He'll still be an SOB. We can go drink as much scotch as you want and talk about what a horrible human being he or she is. But how good would it feel to have them out of your life? Right? Those are the kinds of questions that keep getting asked and re-asked. And there is no one answer, because the truth is, my guess is each of us, and we're good at this, this is what we do, has stayed in similar fights and then look back later and go, what the hell was I thinking? And that's okay, because we're human. That's what it means to be human. Anyone who thinks they know how to do this perfectly and get the best possible result all the time, my advice is run, don't walk from those people, because they're kidding themselves. This is about getting better and better, not being done with the process.
So as mediators, there is some pressure on us to close deals. We call our field alternative dispute resolution, not alternative dispute chit-chat.
Right.
And if a mediator didn't get cases settled, people ask about that. People don't ask so much anymore, what is your settlement rate? Although 25 years ago, people did ask that. So if you're in the position of mediating, trying to help other people settle a dispute, there's pushback, you're questioning to yourself, what really is best? Is it really best for them not to make a deal? Should I keep on plowing here? You know, it sometimes reminds me of those scenes in TV medical dramas where the young doctor is pounding on the accident victim's chest, pounding and pounding and pounding and pounding. And then the older doctor comes by and says, he's dead.
Right.
At what point, how do we know when to say this negotiation is dead?
Well, part of the answer is implicit in the wonderful analogy you made. Who's your older doctor? Who are the people to whom we turn, who appreciate that our job is to be in there working on that patient with every available tool and technique we possess? That is the job. And then there's another job. The person who doesn't have that kind of relationship or obligation to the client and can see a bigger picture. And we trust them enough to come by and say, you know, patient may be dead. And we all need that person. By the way, our clients don't need those people and shouldn't ever have to listen to those people. They need us to pound away. I want to be clear. That is the job. But as you said, who is the older doctor? They can be younger, they don't have to be older, but who is the person who we trust to sometimes say, you know, Jeff, I think this one ain't happening. You've done everything right, and it's not happening. And by the way, that's why it's called alternative dispute resolution. It's not the only form of dispute resolution. And sometimes other means are needed. See, that's what I talk about. We can't so worship any one methodology that we think it's all that's available to us. I'm in favor of alternative dispute resolution, but I think that everything from coercion to rolling over are always things we have at our disposal, depending upon the circumstance. Right? Everything from a person who is beating another person to death, and I'm like, yeah, we're not going to negotiate. I'm going to stop you by any means necessary, as Malcolm X said, all the way over to, yes, this is going on and I'm going to live with it. It's not right. It's not just. It feels lousy, but the alternatives are worse, right? So I take very seriously the notion of alternative dispute resolution, meaning, and by the way, I would say even the best form of dispute resolution, but not the only form. And that gives us some latitude as well.
Okay, I want to open it up. As much as I'm loving chatting with you, Brad, I know other people have questions as well, and I'd like to give them the opportunity to ask those questions. We have about 14 minutes left. Jean, I know you've been monitoring the chat. Are there questions there, or if there are people who would simply like to unmute themselves and pose a question, and as they say on Jeopardy, please make sure your question is in the form of a question.
That's pretty funny, yes. In the chat, there are mostly just accolades and like, wow, this is fantastic. There are not really questions as such. So I would say we should just open the floor and see who would like to go ahead and ask their questions. Anybody?
I would like to ask, I'm sorry I'm off the video. My name's Greg Whitehair. I'm out in Denver. What if you're, so I'm sometimes an advocate, sometimes a mediator, depending on the circumstances. I do a lot of work for my family. And sometimes, and I've got a client who I love but hate. What if I hate my client? I think that they actually have gone the wrong way, but it's my job to forge ahead. Where do I become the student and teacher? And I love everything you've shared. Thank you so much. I'm going to get your book. But help me, because I find myself, I love these people, but they take hateful positions and I'm kind of their guardian and sword bearer.
So, I mean, first of all, Greg, I think, and I'm not just being nice here, I think that your willingness to start by saying, I love them and I hate them, is the groundwork for reaching the best possible answer. It won't always be satisfying, but you've done exactly what I'm inviting us to always do, to say, yeah, I really love them. And you know what? I can't bear them. It's not just they're doing something stupid. They're doing something awful. They're doing something that is so counter to my, Greg's values and wisdom and capacity. And yet I'm stuck being, as you said, their sword bearer. So the first thing is to kind of ask, what can you gain from owning both of those roles? By the way, you would also have to live with, if you really, really, really hate them, why do you let yourself be in that role? You can still love them without continuing to be their advocate. And if the answer is, Brad, that's easy for you to say, I would have to give you a phone call and explain the 6 reasons why I don't have that latitude. And it's not that I would dismiss those reasons. I'm sure they're good and they're right and they're true. But then you would realize that most of your assessment is built on the frustration that you're stuck advocating for someone for other reasons than how hateful their views are. You really wish you weren't in that position. And that's a whole separate deal. And then you'd have to figure out what is it that makes Greg Greg in a good way that allows you to say, you know what? I do hate what they're doing here, but my love for them in general is bigger than my hate for this position. And that's how I can do it. And then make sure that you know that you always have the latitude. Again, at what price, I can't tell you, right? Does it blow up a family? Does it blow up a corporation? That's why this is longer. There's no one stock answer for this. You can walk away. Right? You can walk away. It's just the price may be too high. And my experience is we get angry at others precisely because we know we could walk away, but the price is so damn high we don't want to. And so a lot of our outrage is actually not at them, who I'm sure are hateful and stupid in the ways you describe. Our anger is at ourselves because we're trying to figure out, what am I doing here? I know this is not right, and yet I'm not walking away. Why is that? So I hope at least it's giving you kind of a checklist to work through for yourself. I know it's not an answer, but there isn't a one answer. Those become very contextual, and I would need to know a lot more about the relationship with the clients and what it means. But yes, your willingness to start by saying, I love them and I hate them. The most powerful thing about that formulation is not the love or the hate, it's the and that you can identify with both.
Thank you. The questions are rolling in the chat now. So here's the first one for you, Rabbi. If we say let it go when we are exhausted, how do we as mediators prevent or minimize post-mediation or meeting regret, often referred to as the cold light of day clarity?
Well, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that we should say let it go, right? My experience is usually let it go is a person who really is ready to, trying to convince a person who really isn't. And the person who has the light of day clarity is the one who says, why the hell did I listen? I really didn't want to let it go. So I want to be very careful. Let it go is talk about a sword, a very dangerous sword to wield because it feels so noble. We're going to transcend this moment and just let it go. But the client actually may not be where we are emotionally or intellectually or financially. And so let it go for them, which sounds like very noble philosophical advice, may leave them feeling really screwed.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting is that we talk about, again, the real costs of not letting it go, and then also the costs of letting it go, to try and identify, how will you feel tomorrow? Because this will be over. The documents will be signed, and whether it is that piece of intellectual property or whatever else, it's going to be gone. And we would have to be honest. Are we afraid of opening up that can of worms because it may not let the deal get signed? So we have to be very careful about wielding the advice to let it go, I think, and ask much more about what is the cost of not letting it go? What is the cost of letting it go? And how do you think you're going to feel tomorrow when you've taken that action? And then some of it is also accepting that we often feel buyer's or seller's remorse. We can just go through the steps to try and minimize it, but there's no guarantee it's not going to happen.
A little cognitive dissonance there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What do you do to anchor yourself in the face of someone you're quote unquote learning from?
So I really do believe in the cultivation of curiosity. And I am intensely curious about people. I mean, maybe people who work with me and my family would say more than is sometimes safe. Comes the places that I go and the people that I talk to. But my rule of thumb is if they don't have a gun pointed at me or a knife at my throat, I can afford to be curious, and I really am. And that curiosity helps a lot. Now, again, you also have to have enough sense, and the word grounding is important. I don't think I'm giving up a piece of who I am by listening to those people. That's who I want to be. That's when I said it's not about self-transcendence. It's figuring out who you want to be. I actually want to be the guy who has great curiosity, even about people who, when they're not around me, may be planning to kill me. If I can afford to be curious, I want to be curious, because that's where the breakthroughs happen in science, in law, in religion, in psychology, in our own families. That's where I want to be. So the answer really is, in that sense, an incredibly self-serving answer. You got to figure out who you want to be before you can be much use to anyone else.
Here's another question. How do the principles of respecting the other in negotiation and knowing when compromise won't happen apply in discussions of existential issues such as masking in public, COVID vaccinations, and gun control?
Oh, good. We're back to an easy question. Why not just ask me about your life partner? Look, there's no way to do that. Even, by the way, Jeff, I love you said we have 14 minutes left. Only lawyers. We have about 14 minutes left. What would be, I love that. Look, the first thing is, in my experience, and this is going to sound glib, but it's not meant that way, far fewer issues are quite as existential as we imagine them to be. And I know that's hard, because a lot of us feel that we can't be passionate advocates unless it's truly existential. And I have very deeply held opinions about all three of those issues. And I'm going to say something that I'm not even sure I truly believe, but I'm challenging myself. Gun control in general, and I have very strong feelings about the dangers of our gun-obsessed and gun-saturated culture. Gun control in general, however, is not an existential issue. A person with a gun on the ground, as much as I don't think they should have it, that's an existential issue. When someone walks into a mall or a school with an AR-15 or a semi-automatic handgun with a 15 or 20 round magazine, that's an existential issue. And I don't think we need to feel good about it. I think we need to stop that person no matter what it takes. Gun control is an important cultural legal issue. Again, I have very strong views and have parked my time and my money addressing it, because we're going to keep dying, I believe, until we do. But it's not existential in the immediate sense. And so I think we have to find a place in which to say things can be hugely important without being immediately existential. Right? And I'm still playing out that model, but I do think it's important. And I think if we could make that distinction, it would change everything from how we govern and legislate and change the culture. Right? And that's true for vaccines, and that's true for masking, where again, I have very strongly held views and would like to take a 2x4 to some people's head. But if I'm doing everything that I need to do to take care of me, of getting that vaccine, wearing that mask, and following what the doctors and the science say to do, then it's not existential for me. And it means I have the luxury of being a little calmer and a little more understanding when I talk to that person who, yes, I'll admit it, I think is a lunatic or a moron or both. But I don't have to treat them like that, because the fact is I am not immediately endangered by their lunacy or their stupidity.
We're coming close to an end here. Let me just read one comment to you, and then I'll turn it back over to Jeff for our closing here, so that we've got about 1 minute left. But there's so many thank yous to you in the chat. We can have those printed out to you. But here's one that's just delightful. Deborah Bowen says, Brad, my husband and I are listening with our mouths hanging open. Your opening story was so profound, it left me shaking. I do have to buy the book because you've certainly caused me to take a fresh look at how we have addressed situations previously. You have forced me to seek an approach that might be outside of the box. I am inspired, as usual, when I hear you speak. And that, the wonderful comments just are
Thank
just
you.
like that one.
I just want to very quickly say, I know we're up against the hard. Thank you, Deborah. Deborah is someone with whom I've had the privilege of studying and journeying. And all I can tell you is that your words mean a lot, and I will continue to try to be the person you seem to think I am.
This was just a tremendous presentation. So much in there for us to learn. Thank you so much. We encourage everybody to contribute to food bank, either in New York City or a food bank that's in their community or otherwise important to them. Please let us know about it so that we can add it to our running total. Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, this was just an awesome presentation. Thank you so much. We'll be back next week, and with that, we are complete.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.